It was a regular morning flight, nothing out of the ordinary. The kind of flight where most people just want to get to their destination without much fuss. The cabin was filled with the usual hum of chatter and the soft clink of seatbelt signs clicking on as the plane prepared for takeoff. Amidst the crowd was Mr. Edwards, a well-dressed man, in his late 50s, sitting quietly in his wheelchair, waiting for the flight to begin. His suit was crisp, his demeanor calm, but he wasn't here on a business trip. No, Mr. Edwards was the CEO of the airline, though no one knew it at first glance. As he wheeled himself down the aisle to his seat, he caught the eye of the flight attendant, Kelly. She was young, in her early 20s, with a friendly smile and a little too much confidence for someone on her first week. When she saw him, she didn't see the man who ran the entire airline. She saw a man in a wheelchair, and to her, that meant one thing. He was weak, slow, and not worth much attention. Kelly, with her freshly pressed uniform and a sparkle of self-assurance in her eyes, walked toward Mr. Edwards with a quick pace. The corners of her lips curled into a smug smile, one she didn't even try to hide. The faint hint of amusement that danced in her gaze was so obvious that it felt as if she was daring someone to notice. "Looks like you'll need a little extra help, huh?" she said, a bit too loudly, her voice rising above the soft hum of the cabin. Her eyes quickly darted toward the other passengers, as if to draw attention to her kind gesture. In her mind, she was being the funny flight attendant who could make everyone laugh. But all she succeeded in doing was isolating Mr. Edwards. The chuckle she let out was sharp, almost too eager, like she was trying to prove something. Prove that she was in control, in charge of the situation, and in charge of the atmosphere on the plane. Mr. Edwards, sitting in the wheelchair, held his composure. His hands were tightly gripping the arms of the chair, knuckles slightly white. His face, calm but guarded, told a story of restraint. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to escalate things. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of reacting. But Kelly wasn't done. She leaned a little closer, dropping her voice dramatically, as if she were sharing some kind of private joke with the entire cabin. "What happened? Did you lose a bet or something?" She laughed again, her tone dripping with sarcasm, as though it was perfectly normal to treat someone like this. Her laughter echoed around them, bouncing off the walls of the airplane and catching the attention of nearby passengers. Mr. Edwards' hands gripped the wheelchair's arms harder, his jaw clenching just slightly. The light chatter around them began to fade into a low murmur. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes flicking back and forth between Kelly and Mr. Edwards, unsure if they should intervene, unsure if they should speak up, but no one did. They stayed silent, avoiding the growing tension like it was something they didn't want to get involved in. Kelly, oblivious to the growing unease around her, was still going strong. She was used to being the center of attention, the one who made the awkward moments funny, the one who always had a witty comment to throw into the air. She wasn't used to seeing people like Mr. Edwards, who didn't fit the stereotype of the disabled person in her mind. She wasn't used to someone like him on her flights. She didn't realize that people in wheelchairs could be important, successful, or powerful. To her, they were just out of place. The few passengers who had noticed her treatment of Mr. Edwards exchanged glances, some raising an eyebrow, others shaking their heads slightly, but still, no one spoke up. They were too passive, too hesitant to say anything. They didn't know what to do in the face of this inappropriate behavior. It was easier to stay quiet, to pretend it wasn't happening, to avoid confrontation. But Kelly didn't notice the looks. She didn't notice the heavy silence building. She was too focused on herself, too focused on the idea that this was some light-hearted moment she could control. Her smirk widened, and she leaned in just a little closer to Mr. Edwards, her tone more mocking, her voice louder than it should have been. "You sure you can make it to your seat, or should I help you out a bit more?" she said, as if she was the one doing him a favor. And in that moment, as Kelly continued her little routine, she didn't notice the passenger seated just ahead of her. A man who had been quietly observing the exchange, sitting still, his eyes watching Kelly's every move. The man, with his gray hair and thoughtful gaze, knew exactly who Mr. Edwards was. And as Kelly laughed, he could see the subtle shift in Mr. Edwards' expression. A shift that others wouldn't notice. A shift that spoke volumes of dignity, of patience, of someone who had been through far worse than this, but still chose silence over confrontation. Mr. Edwards didn't respond to Kelly's jabs. Instead, he simply adjusted himself in the wheelchair, taking a slow breath, his eyes steady. He knew that sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all. But what Kelly didn't know was that, right in front of her, the man she had just humiliated was the very person who owned the airline she worked for. The one she had mocked and belittled with her laughter wasn't just a random passenger, he was the CEO. And soon, Kelly would find out exactly who Mr. Edwards was. She just had no idea how the truth would change everything for her. Kelly continued her routine, her mind focused on the usual tasks of a flight attendant, but something had shifted in the air. She couldn't quite pinpoint it, but as she moved down the aisles, helping passengers settle in, there was an odd stillness about the cabin. Perhaps it was the way people were glancing at her, or the faint unease that seemed to pulse through the seats, but Kelly wasn't paying enough attention. She still didn't know what she had done. The plane began to taxi down the runway, the low hum of the engines filling the cabin. The seatbelt sign pinged off with its usual chime, signaling that the flight was in full motion. The sound of the intercom coming to life broke through the air, but Kelly barely registered it. She was still caught up in her own world, still thinking about her little joke from earlier. Then came the voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 432, said the calm, authoritative voice over the loudspeaker. "We're on our way to Los Angeles today, and we have a very special guest on board." The words barely registered at first, until the voice continued, and Kelly felt her stomach drop. It wasn't just any announcement. It wasn't just a captain speaking. It was his voice. "Good morning, everyone. I'm David Edwards, the CEO of this airline. I just want to take a moment to thank you all for flying with us today." Kelly's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to shift beneath her, as if the ground was giving way. She froze, standing still in the aisle, the weight of the realization crushing her chest. She looked down at Mr. Edwards, her face going pale. He was still sitting in his seat, perfectly composed, his hands folded in his lap as if he had all the time in the world. But this time, Kelly saw something new in his eyes, something she hadn't noticed before. There was no anger, no reaction, just a flicker of disappointment. The weight of that look hit her harder than anything else. It was the kind of disappointment that made her stomach twist, the kind that felt like she was standing naked before him, exposed for everything she had just said and done. She had no idea who she had mocked. She had no idea that the man she thought was just another disabled passenger was the very person who ran the company she worked for. And she had humiliated him, in front of everyone. Her cheeks flushed with guilt as the flight carried on, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in her own mistake. The voice of Mr. Edwards had barely faded when Kelly began to see the entire flight in a new light. His words echoed in her head, and she realized just how out of line she had been. She had made him the punchline of a joke, treated him like he was less than anyone else on board. And now, everyone around her would be thinking about what she had said, about how she had laughed at someone who wasn't just a random passenger. The rest of the flight was a blur. Kelly tried her best to focus on her duties, but the guilt gnawed at her, settling into the pit of her stomach. Each task she performed felt heavier than the last, like her hands were tied with invisible ropes. The passengers she had served seemed to be avoiding eye contact, and the weight of their stares lingered on her skin like a burning brand. Her face was hot, her body tense. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept flooding back. The laughter, the mocking tone, the way she had treated Mr. Edwards as if he was nothing. It felt like time had slowed down. The minutes stretched into hours as the flight continued. She couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over in her mind, each time it felt worse. She thought about how she had misjudged him, how she had let her assumptions dictate her actions. When the plane finally landed and the passengers began to disembark, Kelly's heart hammered in her chest. She could see him waiting by the door. Mr. Edwards was the last to leave, and it was clear to Kelly that he was waiting for her. She knew what that meant. She couldn't hide from this, Not anymore. She would have to face him. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked down the aisle, her feet dragging with each step. She tried to calm herself, but her nerves were frayed, every inch of her screaming with anxiety. What could she possibly say to him? What could make up for the humiliation she had caused? As she reached him, her breath came in shaky bursts, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. "Mr. Edwards," she began, her words barely audible. I'm so sorry for what I said earlier. I didn't know who you were. It was wrong, and I was out of line." She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. The words felt weak, inadequate. How could they ever be enough? Mr. Edwards looked at her, his gaze steady, not full of anger but something far more profound, disappointment. His eyes, kind yet firm, spoke volumes, and in that moment Kelly felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. She was no longer just a flight attendant, she was a person who had to come to terms with what she had done. "I know, Kelly," he said softly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made her shoulders slump in guilt. "But you should know that no one deserves to be laughed at or humiliated. Not me, not anyone." His words struck deep, cutting through her defenses. She felt the tears rise, threatening to spill, but she held them back, blinking rapidly to keep herself composed. She wanted to speak, to apologize more, but the lump in her throat made it impossible. What could she say after that? What could she say to someone who had given her so much kindness with just a few words? The silence stretched between them, but it was heavy with meaning. She realized just how much she had messed up, just how deeply her actions had affected him, and she realized that her apology, though heartfelt, could never undo what she had done. As he turned to leave, Mr. Edwards gave her one last look, not one of bitterness, but of understanding. "I hope you remember this, Kelly. I really do," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. And as he walked away, Kelly felt something shift within her. The weight of his words stayed with her, a reminder that respect, kindness, and empathy were things that should never be taken lightly. In the days that followed, Kelly tried to make things right. She reached out to Mr. Edwards with a letter, apologizing once more for her actions. But more importantly, she took to heart the lesson he had taught her. The next time she saw a passenger in a wheelchair, she didn't laugh. She didn't make jokes or act as though they were any less than anyone else. She treated them with the same respect she would anyone else on the plane. And as for Mr. Edwards, he didn't hold it against her. He believed in second chances, but he also hoped that the moment would stick with her, that it would change her, just as it had changed him. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and let us know what you think in the comments. Your feedback means the world to us. And if you want to see more content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Also, if you know someone who would enjoy this story, share it with them. We appreciate your support in helping us grow. Thank you so much for watching, and we can't wait to share more with you soon.